In the late 90s, I was following a military show trial in the wobbly period between two wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo, when I met the main character of what was to become the most trying book I ever wrote. I'm a non-fiction writer at heart, and all through my career, reality has been my material. But this book took me down the slippery slope between fiction and non-fiction. I thought this might be an appropriate moment to share some thoughts about this experience with you. Asani, as I would call him, was in his early 30s when I met him. He was a half-orphaned Tutsi soldier from the high plains of eastern Congo who'd helped the old Kabila overthrow President Mobutu. But as it often goes in those young countries, the revolution Asani had hoped for had failed to materialize. He was a village boy, and he used an image from way back home to convey his deception. In the high plains, he said, they used to burn the savanna grass in the dry season, but they could never burn it all off because the ground under the grass would still be damp. It was the same with Kabila's war, he said. It had only touched the surface. The roots were unaffected. He believed the regime was heading for a monumental crash. His predictions proved accurate. A few months later, Tutsi rebels were lynched and burned in the streets of the capital, Kinshasa. I couldn't imagine Asani surviving this. But he re-emerged 1,000 miles away in the east of the country and rose to become one of the most important soldiers of the new rebel movement. 5 years later, the country was reunited and Asani was appointed as a general of the National Army. When I came home and sat down to write, I evoked the moment I saw Asani for the first time. An enigmatic, suspicious man who just under the surface seemed vulnerable, full of grief, eager to tell his story. I traveled to the austere landscape of his childhood, where growing up without a father meant being unprotected. I became familiar with his adult difficulties in a country where Tutsi was seen as foreigners. I'd found out he wasn't only a victim, but also a perpetrator. Some periods in his biography remained misty, but I'd reached my limits exploring them. Even though a so-called peace had come about in the DR Congo, deep down things weren't quiet. It had been too risky to step into certain fermenting puddles of that post-war marshland, but I was confident I'd be able to write my way around the holes. 5 months into writing, I was ready to throw my first 100 pages into the canal in front of my house and jump right in after them. The years I've been following Asani, feeling one layer after another yield, had been so exciting. But the writing was tedious, redundant. His life story had been burning in my hands. Now it felt cold, dead, out of reach. One afternoon, I went for a ride with a colleague and described the days of anguish when the third rebellion had broken out and Asani was stuck in the capital, Kinshasa, a general in an army he didn't feel loyal to anymore. I can see him, I said to my friend. He's lying on the floor in his living room, the air conditioning isn't working, he's ready to go back to the bush. Why don't you write that down? My friend suggested. The next morning I wrote. He couldn't bring himself to stand up, so he stayed where he was, lying on the carpet, huddled up with his eyes shut. Suddenly he remembered the title of an essay he'd been asked to write for the state exam in high school. In big letters on the blackboard in the study hall it had said, if you go forward, you die. If you go backward, you die. By peeling off the observer, the material became alive. It was shining again. But writing in the third person has its own rules. I had to create a stand-in who Asani would confide in. I had to make him act in situations I'd researched in detail, but hadn't always witnessed. After a second fit of despair, I moved to a Belgian monastery, where old monks sat praying so as to keep me from falling into a dark pit. When the book came out in the Netherlands, I wrote a prefatory note saying, "This book is based on real characters, situations and places, without ever coinciding with them completely." It was a way to tell my readers what I'd done, as well as an attempt to protect Asani. I'd stepped out of the fermenting marshland, but he was still in it. If his superiors summoned him, I wanted him to be able to say, "Yes, I know this woman, and yes, part of her book might be inspired by what I told her, but the man she depicted is not me." My French publisher called it a récit, story. The Americans had bought it as non-fiction, but when they saw the translation, they were at a loss, and asked me to write a preface to explain what I'd done. A publisher note said my book fell, and I quote, into a category, literary reportage, that doesn't have an established tradition in the United States. That came as quite a surprise to me. At school, I'd been bombarded with the terms new journalism and creative nonfiction. I'd always felt greatly indebted to American nonfiction writers. The Rebel's Hour was my third book on Congo. I was on the inside looking out when I spotted Asani. By writing in the third person, I was shedding an old skin. The outcome was maybe somewhat raw. Philip Gorovich and Mia Farrow put it on their list of favorite books on the region. I received a kind letter from John Le Carré, a US Foreign Service officer, called it a powerful book, one of the best on the Congo. But in the end, the book sat a bit uneasily, especially with reviewers in the US and Canada who didn't know Central Africa, nor my earlier work, and didn't have any reason to trust me, like my European readers did. The non-fiction police were at work. Instead of reading the book, they read the prefatory note, the preface and the publisher's note. Without the perspective of the narrator, a reviewer complained, the reader was set adrift. Literary reportage had become a tough sell in a post-9/11 world, someone pointed out, where questions of invented truths had had serious political consequences. The story didn't read as a novel, a third reviewer reproached me. I've written 12 books. The Rebel's Hour was number 9. It's the child that caused me the most trouble, which is why it's most probably closest to my heart. While the others were out there playing, this one knocked on my door time and again, crying, "Mama, they slapped me." Contrary to my other books, it often sets me thinking, should I have written it differently? Could I? But if there is such a thing as truth, it surely isn't any less true than the others. In rendering his story less specific, Asani became more universal. It might, in the end, be my truest book. Thank you.